appropriate for now, and also to enable us to conduct the business of the people in fairly decent arrangements. Thank you. Madam Speaker, so are all of us. And for that, we do recognize that time is of essence even as we seek to get the new arrangements. The hard, cold facts are, however, that this chamber, as we know it, was really not intended for this kind of a configuration.
Joined in the effort to have us sitting here this evening as we are. And you know, they say, home is where the heart is. And I know that as Parliament opens the doors, all of us know in every generation, we enjoy something at one generation, and when we have children, we do something more for our children. So we move a step up as generations go on. And we look forward to that, the movement up, but until then, the movement up, but until then, Health, Dr. Tuff, going ahead with them. Minister of Finance and Public Service, Mr. Clark. Do we have copies of your statement?
Oh my goodness. It's from the chair.
Minister Clark.
Madam Speaker.
Copies of your statement?
Yes, they're on their way, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to give a statement prior to tabling of 3 bills which are on the agenda here for today. And those bills occur in the context of the pandemic and the economic recovery that we are ensuring happens. Madam Speaker, the government of Jamaica is actively putting in place the framework for economic recovery. Much of this rests on ensuring the continued existence of a credible fiscal path that both supports economic recovery and retains debt sustainability. We therefore have to plan not just for today, but we have to look ahead and plan across the medium term. By making adequate plans for Jamaica today, Jamaica will make its way through and emerge stronger. As such, Madam Speaker, today I'll be tabling 3 bills designed to help shape the fiscal path that will underpin economic recovery while not compromising debt sustainability. For the economic recovery to occur, the government of Jamaica has to have the wherewithal to continue to provide the services essential to a modern economy, while at the same time investing in the reforms and the infrastructure that will be necessary to spur innovation, production, and economic expansion. These 3 bills presented today, Madam Speaker, are not about today. The revenues of the government are performing according to plan. These bills have to do with the medium term and ensuring that economic recovery is robust and strong. The 3 bills are meant as a package to be passed together. They do not address the current fiscal year, but instead they lay the groundwork for future fiscal years. We have learned that careful planning is important to maximizing outcomes and providing buffers. Madam Speaker, many countries do not have this luxury to plan ahead at this time, including most in our region. They're busy trying to finance gaps in their current year budget. They're scrounging around trying to find and raise funding for this fiscal year. With gratitude to God Almighty, this is not Jamaica's position. So even in the middle of this global economic crisis, not only are we planning ahead, but we are proposing new institutions to strengthen our fiscal responsibility framework and deepen fiscal transparency. Madam Speaker, I'm proposing to take 2 of these bills to completion next week. Given that the third one proposes a new institution, I propose to give further time for review and consideration, and so we'll take that one a few weeks later. Though I do not plan to take those 2 today, however, Madam Speaker, it is necessary to provide this statement to accompany the tabling of the bills. Several years ago, Jamaica reckoned with a grave problem of fiscal unsustainability, and we made a change of direction. Through effort and sacrifice of the Jamaican people, and through political unity of purpose, we changed course and substantially improved our finances, gaining the admiration of the world. Madam Speaker, this House is aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound economic impact, as the measures required to slow the spread of the coronavirus have curtailed and depressed economic activity here in Jamaica and around the world. The PIOJ and the BOJ have forecasted economic contraction for the current fiscal year to be in the region of 10%, the steepest annual decline in our history. In addition, Statin's July Labour Survey reported that 135,000 jobs were lost as compared with the July 2019 survey. The saving grace, Madam Speaker, is that Jamaica entered this pandemic with significant buffers. And it's very important that we are cognizant of that, because the dividends of good policy as a country is that we have buffers in lean times. Fiscal responsibility, Madam Speaker, provided buffers. Primary balances of 7% or more for 7 consecutive years, among other factors, accounted for a dramatic reduction in public debt that put Jamaica in a relatively better position. Prior to the pandemic, we were on track to achieving a debt-to-GDP ratio in the mid-80s or low 80s by March 2021. However, debt is likely to increase to 103%, primarily due to the contraction of 10% in GDP. In addition, Madam Speaker, the government would have entered the fiscal year with substantial cash reserves, which have been useful in assisting to fill the void created by lower inflows of revenue. And these reserves have been built from fiscal overperformance, from privatization, from reintegration of public bodies into their parent ministries. On the monetary side, various monetary reforms would have introduced two-way movement of the exchange rate and have accommodated a decreased footprint of the central bank in that market. As a result, our reserves increased by $1 billion between 2016 and 2019, and that improved reserve position, or non-borrowed reserves that is, has provided a buffer during the crisis. Today, in the middle of the pandemic, our gross reserves and our net international reserves remain in the region of all-time highs. Madam Speaker, policy reform that made inflation targeting the anchor of monetary policy has allowed for sustained monetary easing prior to the pandemic. The central bank was able to reduce interest rates 10 times since 2018, and interest rates, the policy rate, stands at 0.5%. While room for further lowering has been reduced, easier monetary conditions mean that firms and households can access credit at more affordable prices. Madam Speaker, the capitalization of the central bank over 2 successive financial years has provided buffers. The central bank, the Bank of Jamaica, was capitalized in the amount of $20.6 billion, and central bank reserves settled in the amount of $33 billion over the past 2 fiscal years. These have put the BOJ in a stronger position to pursue open market operations and to relax the reliance on blunt prudential tools. The BOJ's enhanced ability to respond to the liquidity pressures has provided buffers.
Minister, I We have not got a copy of your presentation as yet. We haven't got the copy.
Yes, so Madam Speaker, it's on its way. What I propose to do in the meantime I'll just pass in the meantime until it comes. And I just ask for your accommodation on that as we go along. Yeah? Madam Speaker, in addition to that, Madam Speaker, so the capitalization of the central bank to the tune of $50 billion over the last 2 years has put the central bank in a strong position that in the middle of the crisis, they could provide $50 billion of liquidity to the financial system, which has allowed the wheels of commerce to continue, albeit at a pace that is slowed by the effect of the pandemic. Disaster contingency has provided buffers, Madam Speaker. For 30 years prior to the fiscal year 2018-19, we only had $100 million in our buffers. Over 2 fiscal years, we capitalized to the tune of $4.5 billion, which, as we all know, came in useful during the pandemic. These buffers taken collectively, Madam Speaker, has allowed Jamaica to absorb the economic impact, to respond with economic and social support, which has been at historic levels, budgeted at over $45 billion, including a budget of approximately just under $20 billion through the CARE program. Madam Speaker, you'll hear me reference these buffers again, as it is a demonstration of the fact that policy matters. And when we pursue prudent policy as a country, it provides buffers for lean times. Madam Speaker, the PIOJ and the Bank of Jamaica, as well as international agencies, expect Jamaica to return to economic growth next year. And that growth is likely to be quite a bit stronger than our historical average. This kind of V-shaped recovery is not something that Jamaica's experienced before in terms of historic downturns. In 2009, when we experienced the global economic crisis, the economy declined for 3 successive years after 2008, 9, 10, and 11. In 1976, when we experienced the steepest decline in our history of 6.5%, outside of this year, the economy declined for 3 of 4 subsequent years, 1978, 1977, 1979, and 1980. This time, Madam Speaker, provided that we maintain hard-earned macroeconomic stability, the PIOJ and the Bank of Jamaica expect a fall in output this year to be followed by an encouraging rebound, i.e. economic growth, next year and the year after. Madam Speaker, on the fiscal account so far, for the first 7 months of this year, Jamaica has performed well, given the context. The preliminary figures for the period April to October 2020 show government revenues tracking slightly ahead of budget. There are still 5 months left in the fiscal year, and so we can't celebrate yet, but certainly the year-to-date results represent good news. However, Madam Speaker, at the same time, we must recall that the government revenues are still 17% less than the last fiscal year. Putting it in dollar figures, revenues for the first 7 months of this fiscal year are so far $60 billion less than last year. This is the case, Madam Speaker, even though the government benefits from a contribution of $11.4 billion in non-tax revenues in the form of annual NHT contribution. So despite that, we're still $60 billion less than we were last year for the same 7 months. Madam Speaker, the House will recall that in 2013 and again in 2017, the NHT Act was amended to provide for annual contributions of $11.4 billion per annum. These amounts have been critical to the government's attainment of its fiscal targets over this period across 2 administrations. Ordinarily, this NHT contribution of $11.4 billion per annum would have expired in March 2021. However, given the economic impact of the pandemic, inclusive of the fall in revenues, the contraction in GDP, the anticipated rise in debt to GDP, and given the forecast that annual economic output in real terms may not attain pre-COVID levels before the year 2024-25, now is not the time to have the NHT annual contribution expire. For this reason, Madam Speaker, the NHT amendment bill being tabled today proposes to continue and extend the annual $11.4 billion NHT contribution, which I'll hereinafter refer to as the annual contribution, across the period of economic recovery. Understandably, Madam Speaker, there could be concern that extending the annual contribution from the NHT may be associated with the experience that many NHT contributors have of wanting to purchase a home and being unable to do so. With the consent of the Prime Minister, who has responsibility for the NHT, and the Minister of Housing, the Honourable Minister Charles, both of whom I have consulted with, allow me to say a few words on this, even though it lies slightly outside of my substantive portfolio. But it would be remiss to present this bill and not say a few words. The NHT housing starts, Madam Speaker, have increased dramatically in recent years. There was a near threefold increase over comparative four-year periods. And this is a testimony to the ability to significantly improve NHT housing starts, even while the NHT makes annual contributions to central government. This, Madam Speaker, happens through policy focus. And the government of Jamaica remains committed to an informed policy that is focused on delivering housing for the Jamaican people. Madam Speaker, I was chairman of the NHT in 2017, appointed by the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister broke ground on a housing development in the West, where a private developer, in partnership with NHT, brought 1,500 affordable houses priced at $5 million to market. We had over 10,000 applications. The NHT could arguably have satisfied them all on a phased basis, but there were only 1,500 homes available. I share that anecdote to illustrate that our biggest challenge with satisfying housing demand is not due to the annual contribution by the NHT to the government. Rather, it is that for complex reasons, the supply or production of affordable homes is very limited, despite the demand. And I use the phrase affordable homes to mean homes that a majority of working people can afford to purchase. So in other words, Madam Speaker, there is a market failure in the affordable homes section of the market. Over the years, the NHT has implemented a full range of demand-side subsidies, 0 interest rates on mortgages, 2% interest rates, home grants, etc. But despite you can implement as many demand-side subsidies as you want, if the houses don't exist at the levels that people can afford, the demand remains unfulfilled. The government of Jamaica understands this, and the problem is best solved, Madam Speaker, by government intervention that has the effect of increasing the supply of affordable homes. Among other things, the solution requires scale. The affordable home business is a large volume, low margin business where the developer often backward integrates and puts down his own or her own factories to produce component parts. This requires huge volumes of houses to be viable. So we need large tracts of land where several thousand affordable homes can be developed. Scale reduces infrastructure costs, which reduce prices of homes. That, however, Madam Speaker, may not be enough. The government may also need to go beyond and subsidize the supply by, for instance, covering infrastructure costs and so forth. So the solution to this problem that we can all identify with in this House requires the government to work in partnership with developers who have a track record and who specialize in this area in a transparent, open book manner. In return for supply-side subsidies which deliver housing solutions at targeted prices to the NHT customer, the returns made by the developer are agreed on in advance and are transparent. The government of Jamaica, the Minister of Housing, and of course the Prime Minister are keenly focused on working in partnership with the private sector to significantly increase the supply of affordable homes through these kinds of approaches in an open, collaborative, competitive and transparent manner. And therefore, Madam Speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to give the assurance on behalf of the Government of Jamaica that this policy focus of increasing the supply of affordable homes remains unaffected and will remain unaffected by the necessary continuation of the NHT contribution to central government. The Government of Jamaica will act to support the increase in the production and supply of affordable homes. Indeed, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister's mantra from the last term was to build houses. Houses were built, and that will continue. Madam Speaker, Jamaica's fiscal responsibility framework prescribes that the fiscal balance, which is the difference between government revenues and government expenditure, that should be targeted in any year, and that is computed to be consistent with attaining a 60% debt-to-GDP target by a fixed time. Due to the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, earlier this year, both Houses of Parliament approved that the date by which the 60% debt to GDP ought to be met would be amended to 27-28, that is the fiscal year 2027-28, a shift of 2 years from the earlier legislated date of 2025-2026. Also, earlier this year, due to the economic impact of the COVID pandemic, the Parliament approved the government's triggering of the escape clause under the said fiscal rules. This allowed the government to target a fiscal balance lower than originally programmed. With the passage of the second supplementary estimates, the fiscal balance being targeted is negative 3.5% of GDP, as compared with the prescribed balance of 0.6% of GDP. This means that the deviation approved by Parliament from what the fiscal rules prescribe is 4.1% of GDP. Madam Speaker, this is huge, but it's still quite tame relative to deviations experienced by our regional counterparts. An analogy can demonstrate how our fiscal rules work. The government is required to put aside each fiscal year fiscal savings, which we call the primary balance, that can at least pay your interest costs so that we can reduce our debt over time. The primary balance is nothing more than the fiscal balance being targeted to which interest costs are added. In any year that we miss our fiscal savings target, the government is required to correct that by saving more in the subsequent 2 years. So the fiscal rules have an inbuilt correction mechanism. Given the size of the COVID-19 induced fiscal deviation this year, the rules as they exist will require increased fiscal savings, i.e. an increased fiscal balance, in the next fiscal year, 2021-22, and the one after, in 2022-23. And that is inevitable, Madam Speaker. However, we will be proposing with a bill tabled today to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act in a manner that results in a moderation of this correction mechanism in the fiscal rules to allow for a gentler correction of this year's fiscal deviation. The consideration, Madam Speaker, is that too steep a correction in the fiscal savings or the primary balance could hamper the speed of economic recovery. However, it's important to acknowledge, Madam Speaker, that we won't be able to get away altogether from the requirement of a continued large fiscal savings, simply given the large size of the government's interest bill, which hovers between 5%, 5.5%, 6% of GDP. So we don't pay our interest costs or interest bills from revenue, i.e. from fiscal savings, then by definition what we're engaged in is borrowing to pay interest, a practice of the past, which, with the size of our debt, which is going to be at about 103% by next year, would quickly result, or the risk exists, that would quickly result in economic instability and unsustainability, which would complicate and hence delay economic recovery. Madam Speaker, if the correction mechanism is not amended, the government of Jamaica would be required to target a primary balance of 6.3% of GDP in 2021-22 and a primary balance of 8.7% of GDP in 2022-23. Madam Speaker, I think over the past 7 years we have targeted primary balances of 7%, 7.5%, 6.5%. I think we'll all in this House very easily see that targeting a primary balance of 8.7%, not next fiscal year but the year after, is likely to be inimical to the prospects of economic recovery. And even going from the 3.1% primary balance this year to the 6.3% next year in one jump can also have issues. However, Madam Speaker, the rules are such, and our own interest is such, that over time we have to work towards continuing to reduce debt, which requires that we cover our interest costs at a minimum. The impact of the proposed amendment, therefore, Madam Speaker, would allow the targeting of a primary balance of 5.8% of GDP in 2021-2022, still a tall order from the 3.1% that we will start with from this year, and a primary balance of 7.1% in 2022-23, which would allow a more gradual correction mechanism and provide more room in the early stages of the economic recovery, while still being consistent with attaining the 60% debt to GDP target by 2027-28. So the second bill being tabled today, Madam Speaker, the Financial Audit and Administration Amendment Bill, is aimed at moderating the correction mechanism to ensure a path that accommodates economic recovery while still achieving the 60% debt to GDP target by the new date of 2027-28. Madam Speaker, it's also important to acknowledge that the best time for correction is when we expect to be experiencing recovery kind of growth. And we expect to be experiencing that over the next 2 years, at a minimum. Madam Speaker, the third bill being tabled today is the bill to establish an independent fiscal commission. Madam Speaker, this is consistent with the Government of Jamaica's policy commitments to institutionalize fiscal transparency and strengthen Jamaica's fiscal responsibility framework. The Fiscal Commission will be the guardian and interpreter of Jamaica's fiscal rules, monitoring compliance with these fiscal rules, reporting on fiscal outcomes, and keeping the public informed by providing independent analysis on fiscal policy developments. The Fiscal Commission will be full-time and dedicated to these tasks. Madam Speaker, the Fiscal Commission will have access to relevant data from anywhere in government to allow it to perform its function. It has been the Jamaican experience that we have benefited from the process of an informed, independent assessment of Jamaica's fiscal path with regular, independent communication to the Jamaican people. Madam Speaker, while the Fiscal Commission is no panacea, and at its best it represents only an informed second opinion, it is a necessary institution. With the Fiscal Commission, we seek to institutionalize around the principles of, one, enhancing accountability of the policymaking process, 2, deepening the transparency of government finances, 3, strengthening the credibility of government's fiscal path, 4, promoting inclusiveness in the policy discussion space, and 5, taking greater societal ownership of Jamaica's economic direction. As I've shared before, Madam Speaker, a fiscal commission is an institutional necessity in the pursuit of economic independence. Economic independence, Madam Speaker, does not mean that you don't experience economic shocks. On the contrary, there will always be times of economic expansion and times of economic shocks. Those are natural parts of the economic cycle and the natural consequences of the business cycle. Economic independence, on the other hand, Madam Speaker, means that you can absorb these shocks. You have the buffers and the means to absorb shocks, maintain your independence, and chart your way back to economic expansion. Economic expansion, Madam Speaker, entails a domestication of the policy-making and consensus-building processes and requires us to pursue policies that result in Jamaica having greater flexibility and an increased ability to address priority areas as determined by Jamaicans with responsibility and without compromising that very independence. Madam Speaker, the government of Jamaica proposed this independent fiscal institution. The government of Jamaica committed to it, and by tabling this bill today, the government is delivering on its commitment. So, Madam Speaker, in concluding, the government of Jamaica, or the fiscal accounts of the government, are on track this year for the first 7 months, tracking ahead of our supplementary budget. It's important, however, Madam Speaker, to always be planning ahead, looking 2 or 3 years ahead and making plans today. Economic recovery is dependent on that. And it is important that our plans take into account our priority of economic recovery while also maintaining fiscal credibility and debt sustainability. For these reasons, Madam Speaker, the accommodations that require an amendment to the NHT Act and an amendment to the Financial Audit and Administration Act are necessary. But even in the face of the pandemic, Madam Speaker, we are building out the institutional framework and deepening the structures that provide for fiscal and monetary transparency. Only a few weeks ago in this House, we passed a bill to grant independence to the Bank of Jamaica, to the central bank, and to strengthen its governance and accountability frameworks. And today, we're tabling the bill that will give life to an independent fiscal institution to further entrench and deepen fiscal responsibility in Jamaica. Madam Speaker, I will table the bills later today and look forward to the support of all in this House for the passage of the first two next week at next week's sitting, and for us to consider and pass the bill on the Independent Fiscal Commission shortly thereafter. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Yes. Madam Speaker, we had a bit of a disadvantage because copies were not made available on a timely basis, and I'm just getting them now. But I thank the Minister nevertheless for his presentation. In a sense, he's foreshadowing the opening of the debate on the bills by making a statement in advance. Yes. It's covering some of the same ground, no doubt. The same speech. So, anyway, I don't intend to do that. But there are just 2 points I wish to make. First of all, as regards the taking of an annual amount of $11.4 billion out of the National Housing Trust, this was introduced for the first time, I think, back in 2013, and was a necessary measure at that time in order to assist Jamaica to get through the very heavy fiscal burden that was required of a primary surplus target of 7.5% of GDP in a context where we were beginning the transformation of the Jamaican economy towards stabilizing the public finances. It was a controversial measure, and I can well remember the criticisms that were levied against the government at the time by the then opposition, both in the House and the Senate. Indeed, the matter was even taken to court. Initially, the opposition party of the time, I think, passed a resolution to commence proceedings to challenge the constitutionality of it, but they didn't proceed with that. But an NGO called CAPI, which I think a former Deputy General Secretary of the opposition party of the time was a co-founder of, did sponsor litigation, which ultimately failed, and the courts upheld the legality of the amendments to the National Housing Trust Act. When there was a change of government in 2016, the new government, which is on the same side as the current government, saw it necessary to extend that arrangement for a further 4 years, which would have come to an end in March next year. So it would have been 8 years of extracting $11.4 billion a year from the National Housing Trust. Now we're being told it's going to be extended for another 5 years after that. So that will mean 13 years of extraction of resources from the National Housing Trust of $11.4 billion a year. The minister said that it isn't impacting the housing market to do that. He says that there's a supply-side problem in the housing market, in affordable housing, which I agree there is. But I don't see how it can be possibly said that taking that level of resources out of the National Housing Trust doesn't weaken the Trust's ability to address those supply-side issues. It doesn't make sense to me to say that. Clearly, if there were more resources available to the Trust, it could do more to help developers through subsidies of infrastructure and other things that would enable houses to be built, more houses to be built. It doesn't make sense to me to say that taking $57 billion out of the National Housing Trust over the next 5 fiscal years is not going to impact the Trust's ability to partner with the private sector to deliver affordable housing at a greater rate than it will be as a result of those resources not being available to it. The other point I wish to make relates to the adjustment to the fiscal rules. There's a certain irony to this, because I remember when we enacted the legislation to introduce the fiscal rules into the law. At that time, the minister was then in the Senate. And he was very in favor of the fiscal rules, and indeed, he called for it to be enshrined in the Constitution as a constitutional amendment. And of course, were that so, we wouldn't now, and indeed early this year, be so easily amending the fiscal rules to face the predicament that the country now finds itself in. And at the time, I had made that point that, you know, these were new rules that were going to affect the country going forward, and one cannot predict the future with any certainty. So to enshrine them in such a way that they could never be adjusted might not be a wise move. And I think the minister would support that position now, because he's made 2 amendments to the fiscal rules in the current fiscal year. One was to push out by 2 years the period by which Jamaica must achieve the debt sustainability target of 60% of GDP from 2025-26 fiscal year to 2027-28 fiscal year. And now, the minister intends to amend the adjustment mechanism, which is required to bring the fiscal accounts back on track, so to speak, where you deviate from what the fiscal rules would otherwise have required you to achieve by way of garnering savings to pay down debt from the budget. So the scheme that's in the law currently requires that adjustment to be made over 2 years. The minister has pointed out that that might be counterproductive in a scenario where we are going through what he's just told us is a projected 10% real GDP contraction this year. Jamaica has never gone through in 1 year a 10% real GDP contraction. And of course, we all want the economy to bounce back. And it's going to take some time to get back to the levels where it was before the COVID crisis commenced. And the minister's point is that if we have to comply with the fiscal rules in their current configuration and make up that 4.1% of GDP deviation that has occurred this year, in over 2 years, it means running primary balances which are too high and would set back the recovery process. I sympathize with the notion that we need to ensure that the recovery is not undermined, and I take some comfort from the fact that he has told us that the ultimate target, which is to achieve debt sustainability at a level of 60% of GDP by the revised period of 2028, will be maintained, notwithstanding the easing of the fiscal rules mechanism for recovering the lost pace, so to speak. And so I'm not going to oppose the adjustment, the fiscal rule that is proposed. I haven't read the bill, it was just handed out, but I assume it is consistent with what you have said. It's a very short bill, yeah.
But that is only a hope.
Yes, that's only a hope. So, Madam Speaker, the other issue, of course, is the impact that the current economic crisis is having on the people of Jamaica. And, you know, we had the CARE program primarily in the first 4 to 6 months of the fiscal year. And persons benefited from the compassionate grant in particular, which was targeted at those who are really outside of formal employment. And of course, we know that in Jamaica, there are many people who fall into that category, living through informal means of one sort or the other. The effect of the pandemic on the economy continues to hurt. The original projection for the contraction in the economy this year was roughly half of what we're now being told is the level of contraction. So I can only say that the measures to support those people who have lost work, lost their hustling, and are otherwise feeling the pain of this steep, sharp contraction need to be revisited. And we need more to be done to support those who are suffering at the moment from the effect of this. Madam Speaker, this was not the opening of the debate on the bills. This is a statement by a minister. I will, at this point, reserve the opportunity to address these issues again, having had a chance to consider them when the bills come to be debated next week. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, the Minister said the drawdown from the NHT has not affected the ability of the NHT to deliver on its mandate. I want to ask the Minister 2 specific questions. Can he confirm whether, in a joint venture agreement with a developer, whether the NHT has not been able to provide the funds to that developer, and instead the developer has had to borrow the money elsewhere, and the NHT is paying the interest on that loan? And the reason for that is cash flow issues at the NHT. Secondly, can the Minister confirm whether the NHT has divested either part or all of the portfolio of the Joint Finance Mortgage Program, which is done with financial institutions, and what price that divestment was done for?
So, Madam Speaker, I want to thank the opposition leader for his remarks and for the remarks and questions of the honourable member. With respect to the first point that was made, my point on the impact of the drawdown is the experience that a lot of Jamaicans have, a lot of working people have, is that though they can qualify for an NHT loan, they can't find a house that is at their particular price point. And the point I'm making, and I hope I'm not misunderstood on it, or if I said it the wrong way around, I hope that you accept this as my definitive statement, or as what I'm trying to say. The 11 billion in and itself doesn't solve that person's problem. The fundamental problem that we have, which is a complex one and one that's not has not been easy to solve at scale, okay, is the fact that Jamaica does not produce, the market does not supply sufficient quantities of homes that cost $7 million and $8 million and $6 million. And there is a demand for, on the parts of tens of thousands of Jamaicans for homes at that price. Now, solving that is going to require a project-like approach over a number of years. And your planning of that in itself might take the first year, 2 years, an absorptive capacity to deliver is such that you won't start having those will come on stream after your planning and your groundbreaking and so forth. So the point I'm making is that that problem is solved by attacking the market failure and the supply side, which will require resources. However, you have a lot to do before you come to resources. And what the NHT has been doing over a number of years is its sweet spot has not been in that segment. Its sweet spot has been in the segment that is above, meaning financing mortgages for persons in the private market who are buying, homes that cost more. And in the NHT review, which I was asked to chair by the Prime Minister, what just needs to happen there is pursuing measures that can solve the supply side market failure, which is not, it is not first and foremost a resource problem. We don't have developers, other countries have developers many developers that specialize in this area. We have maybe one or two of persons who go and they build 5,000, 6,000, $6 million houses. That's a particular kind of business. I just shared an anecdote that I would have, during my time as chairman of NHT, traveled, went to Dominican Republic, met with persons who make these kinds of, provide solutions at this particular price point, which is a particular kind of business, and with developers further afield. To come here and set up shop, they need massive scale. Now, there are Jamaican entities that have done this in the past and can do it. And we had put advertisements out, for example, in the paper saying, hey, and I can share those ads with you, here are parcels of land, 450 acres of land that you could build several, 4,000 houses on it. Come to the NHT with your proposal, developer, and tell us how you can help us solve this. We advertised that twice. There were no developers who came forward with anything substantial. So the point I'm making to you is that there's a complex nut to crack with respect to putting in place the arrangements that will unlock overwhelming supply of affordable homes. And that is what we need to do, and that's what we're focused on. And that is not first and foremost, is not first and foremost a resource problem. That's the only point I was making there. With respect to the point on the constitutional amendment, I remember those conversations well, and I thank you for your graciousness. At the time, you were a minister, and you accommodated my overtures and suggestions, and we had a discussion around it. I mean, clearly, though, honourable opposition leader, clearly, something to go into the Constitution would not be the exact bill that is here. A constitutional amendment would summarize the principle So what I had in mind at the time is that the principle of fiscal responsibility be embedded in the Constitution. And there is a way to do it that doesn't, you wouldn't have these interruptions. It's just the principle that pursuing debt sustainability ought to. But I clearly accept the point that the fiscal rules as drafted, clearly accept that point. But I just, with respect to the comment on Jamaicans, I just want to, in receiving, we have pursued the provision of economic and social support to Jamaicans as a national objective. We've made applications open, persons can apply online, doesn't matter who you are, once you qualify and so forth. But Madam Speaker, we have earlier this year, or certainly at the beginning of this new administration, we did something that we did not make a lot of. We extended the grants under the set cash and the best cash components from September to December, which means that approximately between those two components, 50,000 Jamaicans would have received grants from the government for the 9 months between April and December. Madam Speaker, we have had people unemployed before, many times in Jamaica's history. I don't think there's a case in the past where a government has provided monthly support to unemployed Jamaicans through a verified process over a period of 3/4 of a year, and this government has done that and is doing it. Now, let me take the opportunity, Madam Speaker, to say to those who are on the set cash program that the set cash payments, I know I've seen on social media, many people are asking about it, the set cash payments for September and October, the team is working for them to be paid by next week. There have been technical difficulties, but by next week those payments should be with the recipients, which means that they will end up with this, they're likely to end up with 3 payments in 1 month, because November will also be paid by the end of by the end of December. And Madam Speaker, that's not something we're looking to receive credit for, but it's by process of information. I think it's very important to acknowledge that something new has happened, where persons who have found themselves unemployed as a result of the pandemic have had the opportunity for monthly support from the government of Jamaica, to the tune of 50,000 people in total. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't others who are in need of support. And indeed, the Prime Minister announced a couple of weeks ago a program through members of Parliament that is designed to help some in need. And we will continue to strive to find ways of improving support to Jamaicans at this point in time. Madam Speaker, with respect to the question asked by the honourable member, the NHT had a practice in the past of, and I'm taking with the Prime Minister's consent to answer, because I'm not the minister responsible, but the NHT had a practice in the past of lending to developers, right? The NHT, to the best of my knowledge, certainly when I was chair, moved away from that practice because it was not seen as the best use of resources, unless, and of course, persons are doing affordable homes. Okay, so the policy position was that you're better off lending directly to mortgagers. Developers can go and get financing in the private market. We have done a lot to reform our economy, to introduce measures that have brought about stability and have reduced interest rates. So there's no ends of financing in the private market for development. If the NHT were to engage in developer financing, then that special position would have to be reserved if you're going to do affordable homes. $4, $5, $6, $7 million homes. So I'd put that to you as my response to your question. With respect to the joint financing mortgage program, the NHT had a policy introduced several years ago of taking contributions from employees and employers and lending them to building societies for those building societies to unlend. Now, if you examine those portfolios, and that is good and totally is not, not against that. But I want to also share the fact that 95% of that portfolio does not consist of persons in the affordable home segment. And the NHT having loan balances to private commercial institutions, again, it's not, when that program was set up several years ago, it wasn't envisaged that NHT would end up lending something like $40 billion, $45 billion to building societies and private financial institutions for unlending. That is not a sustainable course of action. So yes, measures were taken and by the way, those loans to the building societies were at concessional interest rates and this spanned administration, I should say. And those loans are concessional interest rates, I believe 1 or 2%, with an agreed margin put on by the building society to unlend to consumers. Now, clearly, if you're going to, the NHT has a choice to sit and collect that 1% or 2% over the life of those portfolios, or it can make a choice to say, no, I want to move in a different direction and I want to monetize that. And the NHT has engaged, to the best of my knowledge, in transactions where they've said to these building societies, I want to monetize that and take that back. And that's perfectly legitimate and in the right of the NHT as it tries to optimize its financing. And at another occasion, we ought to have, and it would be a technical discussion on the NHT and how it can optimize financing. For the most part, it's unusual for an institution of that nature where your capital is the same as your assets, right? So it's what you're doing, you're sitting on, $250 billion of capital in the NHT, $250 billion of capital. And if we could get beyond the narrow partisan differences that divide us and the politicization of institutions at the NHT, I think there's room for discussion about how we can better serve the interests of the Jamaican people, provide more affordable homes by while maintaining all of the legal rights and the opportunities of Jamaicans, but by using policy approaches that are that have a creative element, and but that's a discussion that's impatient of having. And if you're open to it, we'll be happy to have.
Yeah. One second, just to be specific, Minister. So, can you confirm then that there's been a policy decision to either sell parts of these portfolios to private companies, whether they be building societies or other financial institutions, and at what price it was sold? And then secondly, coming back to my first question, while I accept what you said about the shift to having developers borrow on the private market, why would the NHT in a scenario be paying the interest on behalf of a developer who has borrowed on the private market?
So Madam Speaker, through you, with respect to the last question, I am not in a position to speak on a specific transaction that you're alluding to. I can just give you, the higher level, but the NHT does enter into joint ventures and has been known to enter into joint ventures. I can't speak to that one in particular. That one? Right. So, I mean, certainly as I gave the example of the project in the West that I alluded to, in which there was a joint venture and the NHT had lent, had provided funding. I don't know if that's a project. That's a project. Oh, okay. So this would be the second phase of it. So they would have started, if that is a project, right, it's dangerous to go on some, but if that is a project, okay.
The question is, we totally understand that NHT lends to developers, but why would you have a scenario where you are in a joint venture with a developer, the developer is encouraged to borrow on the open market, and the NHT pays the interest on that? That's really the question.
Right. So, you know, I was listening to two people a while ago, so I didn't get the last thing that you said. Just, you can repeat it for me?
The question I'm asking is, what would be the benefit to the NHT that is in a joint venture with the developer? We know the NHT lends to developers. That's not my question at all. But in this scenario, the NHT, the developer has borrowed on the open market, but the NHT is paying the interest on that loan.
Yeah. So I can't speak to the specifics of that particular transaction. I do know that the NHT was in the process, had, you know, in the management of its cash flow, it was that sale that you referred to of the joint mortgage portfolio. It was expecting that transaction to be closed on a particular date, and it was closed later. And I'm not sure if that at all influenced. I can't speak to it definitively. But with respect to the joint finance program,
Is there a cash flow challenge at the NHT that would have either necessitated the sale of the joint mortgage program or would have caused the NHT to encourage a developer to borrow on the open market but yet still pay the interest?
Okay. So to understand the operations of the NHT has a plan each year, and that it pursues, and it pursues that plan consistent with the financing that's available. The NHT has been very ambitious and very aggressive over the last few years, as we have spoken about today and over the past few months, in the rapid increase in the housing starts. As a part of its planning, in order to meet those requirements and so forth, part of what it did was that it took this joint mortgage portfolio that it has, where it lends to developers, okay, and gets 1% or 2%, and it had, you know, made a decision that, look, if you really want to solve the affordable home problem, you're going to have to make decisions. You're going to have to allocate capital in a way that's consistent with your desire. If you don't, you can just leave things to go as they are. And the decision that has been made in order to fulfill the program that NHT has, the decision that has been made has been to monetize the sections of or segments of the joint mortgage finance portfolio where the NHT lends to institutions at 1 or 2%, and that portfolio had grown to something like $40 billion, representing 20% of NHT's overall assets. I mean, that's not what we want NHT for. And even from my time as chairman, there were efforts, negotiations, even from then. So it's not something that was done today because of a cash flow need. From when I was chairman, those discussions started when the balances were much less than 40 billion, because we just saw that as not the best way to arrange. If you are absolutely serious about what I've heard your former opposition leader, your current opposition leader speak about, if we genuinely want to solve that problem, we can solve it. But it's not going to be solved if we politicize the decisions of the NHT, right? So and I'm not accusing you of doing that. I'm just making it. Okay. All right. I'm making it clear that I'm not accusing a member of doing that. No, it's necessary to state it because others may be so enticed. But what I'm saying to you, though, is those conversations to sell a portfolio, multi-year conversations, would have started certainly from when I was chairman. It probably even started before. In fact, it probably did start from before. And I believe that it materialized earlier this year, or parts of it materialized earlier this year. In terms of the price, it's a portfolio on which the NHT is earning, in some cases, 1% a year, in other cases, 2% a year on a large portfolio. Anybody who understands cash flows and the present value of a stream of income understands that if somebody is paying you 1% a year, then if you say to the person, no, I want to buy that out, then you're going to buy it out not at face value. You're going to buy it out using a discounted cash flow. Right, and that's just standard. And we need to be able to make those kind of economic decisions without playing on people's lack, right. Yeah, so that is what we did. I don't have the price here because I didn't come here to speak about it, so I don't know what the price is. But by definition, the price represents a discount to face value because you are exchanging a stream of cash flows that is at 1% interest and you're discounting it at market interest rates. Okay? But that was, as I said, a series of transactions that negotiating with the billing society counterparts over quite a few years to be in a position for that to be executed. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Minister Tufton. Thank you, Minister Clark. Dr. Tufton.
Thank you. If you'll indulge me, Madam Speaker, to put a question to the Honourable Minister of Finance. We all agree. We all agree that the Housing Trust represents a vital institution. In fact, we should probably take some time out to say thanks again to Michael Manley and his administration for conceptualizing the National Housing Trust. I think we would all agree, especially given the changes that have been made along the way to the operations and in some way encroaching on the mandate insofar as it was designed to focus on the need of those at the lower end of the income spectrum for housing. My question is, given the need for a review overall of its functioning and of the way to maximize the benefits flowing to the people, especially the poorer people in the society, has the government given any thought as to what mechanism for an overarching policy review which could involve all the stakeholders, including stakeholders in the Parliament, as far as the National Housing Trust is concerned? So that's question one. Question two is the Minister aware that it has been mooted at times in the past that an assessment of the overall, what you might call payroll taxes, the tax deductions involving NHT contributions, national insurance fund contributions, there are the indirect contributions through the National Health Fund. And against the background of cash balances being built up in the National Housing Trust, the question was mooted that there could be value in making an assessment of all these deductions with a view, first of all, to reducing the burden on the taxpayer, and two, possibly incorporating other benefits, including a national health insurance benefit for the population. And is the Minister and the government prepared to undertake that kind of review at this point in time? Question two. Question three. The Minister and indeed the whole country. In fact, if I must confess, I've often shared a thought for your predicament in the face of COVID as Minister of Finance, because I can imagine all the demands that come to your desk and your difficulty in meeting the demands. But the expectation of the recovery that you put in the legislation, as I said in an aside, is really at this point just a hope, because we have no hard data before us to indicate the source of a bounce back, the pace of a bounce back in the economy, the emergence of new sectors that may contribute to the pace of recovery in your debt improvement trajectory that you are envisaging. But put that aside. There are positive signs. There is at least the most positive is the likelihood of a vaccine coming online and the kind of recovery that might entail. But my question really is whether Jamaica, through you, is engaging in the kind of economic stroke financial diplomacy which would be very necessary not just for us but for the Caribbean, given the scale of our debt, if we are to recover and not be collectively pushed down further on the ladder of development because of the lack of external support. Some has come, but it is very small in relation to our needs. Are you considering engagement with CARICOM partners and along with them with the international financial institutions with a view to finding some sustenance for the Caribbean? There's a lot of discussion taking place about emerging markets, but sadly, it does not include the small island developing states at this point, but larger, more powerful states. So those are the three questions. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions, Honourable Member. On the first question, with respect to solving this problem of affordable homes, Madam Speaker, through you, I put it to you, this is an eminently solvable problem. It is easier to solve with political unity than it isn't. Okay? The government, I know the Prime Minister, is committed to solving it. You weren't here, I don't believe, when I went into just to describe that the real essence of the problem that we face with respect to is the unavailability of homes at affordable prices. And affordable prices means homes that the majority of working people can afford. Our per capita GDP is 5,000. By definition and by anecdote, US dollars. It means that the vast majority of our people that we know, right, earn incomes, the vast majority, earn incomes that are less than $1 million Jamaican dollars a year. And an affordable home means a home that somebody on those incomes can afford. To do that, we need homes that cost $6 and $7 million to be available at scale in Jamaica. And the anecdotes bear witness to this. I gave the anecdote when the Prime Minister broke ground in 2017 on a development in the West. There were 1,500 homes at $4.5 and $5 million that were on sale, and there were 10,000 applications. And the NHG, the funding is there to supply those applications, but the homes just don't exist. We, put advertisements out on 2 separate occasions, offering tracts of land. The only proviso is that you build an affordable home. Got no serious takers. And the reason is that it's a very different business from the business of, doing the kind of 20-unit schemes or the 100-unit schemes or the 250-unit schemes that predominate or that dominate our housing landscape. To do affordable homes, you need to be doing it in numbers of 3,000 and 5,000 and even 10,000. And that's an entirely different business. And we don't have, there's probably 1 or 2 in Jamaica who would have to ramp up to do that. Yes, I am aware, fully aware. It is going to require, and that's the point I was making, is that it's not first and foremost a resource problem, right? When you go to the Dominican Republic, they have demand, they have supply, but they don't have an NHT. Our problem is that we have an NHT, we have the demand, but we don't have the supply. And solving that supply bottleneck is going to require intense discussions and negotiations, which is going to take time to implement. But if we are so minded, we can do it. The NHT for most of its existence would have operated in a Jamaica characterized by gross instability, with interest rates at very, very high levels. And so for most of its life, the NHT's dominant strategy was just to provide an option that was lower than the private market. Today, the private market offers interest rates, in some cases, for mortgages beginning with a 6. So the scope of the NHT, to be we need to, collectively reposition. Yeah. So the mechanism is to, introduce supply-side subsidies in conjunction with developers, where the government would either subsidize the price of the infrastructure or the price of the land or other supply-side costs, in a view to achieving a target price. But that can only happen in a spirit of transparency, where it's an open book arrangement, where the developer opens his or her books to everyone, to the government, and you have a transparent margin. And that has happened before in Jamaica. In fact, the Westmoreland, the development in the West that I allude to was an open book kind of development. And that's the approach that the government is going to take. We have to first, agree on the tracts of land that the developers are interested in, and then sit down and negotiate a framework in a procurement format that can satisfy the Jamaican people that it is, open and transparent, and then get to business. And any amount of affordable homes we produce, there'll be demand for. And the government is committed to do it, and it can happen faster with your support. You heard what I said? It can happen faster with your support, because you're going to have to make decisions. You're going to have to make decisions, and you're going to have to prioritize. But if there's a time to prioritize and make decisions, it is now. With respect to your question on Social Security, absolutely. There is tremendous scope for efficiencies in Social Security payments. And again, that's one of the issues that we need, both opposition and government need to come to see eye to eye on, because again, it involves decisions that interfere with our historical notions of this is mine, I set it up, this is yours, you set it up, you can't change what I set up, and those kind of things. The NHT came out of the National Insurance Scheme. The National Insurance Scheme was started by a Labour Party government in the 1960s. Right? So what we need to do now is not say, I start this and I start that. You don't touch this, you don't touch that. Because if there's ever time to economize on resources, it is now. And for the same contributions in aggregate, we can get more benefits from them. I.e., if you add up NHT, NIS, and from employer and employee, and instead of having them separate, you had some kind of ways of gaining efficiencies, we could introduce new benefits to the Jamaican people. And the Minister of Health will know that one of the things that the position that we've adopted on is that we have to gain efficiencies in our existing Social Security arrangements, before we say, let's go and massively step them up. I think the Jamaican people would be happy to step them up if they see that we are using those resources efficiently. And we do know that NIS, suffers from long-term sustainability issues, right? It had, in 30 years, the actual calculations show that's going to, and that's an approximate, it might be 25 or something like that. It shows that the NIS is going to come under significant sustainability pressures. So the time is really now for us to, and this government is committed to that, and we've started the process from a technical point of view, i.e. technically how would you do it, right? Because each of these taxes has a different base. It's not, right? It makes life difficult for small business. The way you calculate NIS is different from the way you calculate ed tax, it's different from the way you calculate NHT. You can't just say it's 11% of payroll because you have to take this in, take that out, and so forth. So the time, member, is ripe for consolidation, for efficiency, and for us to amend and update these institutions to fit today's purpose without being, I'm going to use a word here, without being tribal about the origins of the institutions. It was Jamaicans who developed them, thank God. And we are Jamaicans too. And if the demands of today require that we change those institutions, then we must have the courage to do so, and do so in unity. With respect to the query on economic recovery, it's not so much, the confidence about recovery is not something that I have just, right? It comes from analyses done by the PIOJ, by the Bank of Jamaica, by the CDB, by the IMF, by the IDB. I mean, they all, in their projections and analysis, have Jamaica experiencing way above average economic growth next year and the year after. And the simple reason is that the economic crisis is not caused by some structural issue, some supply side issue, or the economic crisis has been caused by the fact that we have had to stay still. And human beings can't move around like they normally could. And therefore economic activity has been depressed. Provided that in the short term we can once again move around like we used to, and that is the big if, right? Provided that that is the case, then there will be, economic activity will resume. And we will experience a substantial increase in economic activity, which will result in growth. Now, the challenge is going to be to go beyond that, rubber band response, meaning it's natural that when you stretch it, that bounce back response. The challenge is going to be over the long medium term to sustain an above average growth rate. And that is where the challenge is. But in the short term, as long as a vaccine is available, all the experts expect that as long as we can move around again as we did before, we'll have an increase in economic activity, not to the level of where we were pre-crisis, but certainly above where we are now. And then with respect to the question on Caribbean economic diplomacy, there is a movement, member. There is a Caribbean Economic Recovery Task Force that has been set up by CARICOM heads of government, and I've been asked to serve on it with the consent of the Prime Minister. It's been led by the Minister of Finance from Barbados and has a number of persons on it. And we are in very different positions, however, thank God. And just by virtue of if you look at, those countries have no choice but running negative primaries and so forth, right? And some of them are trying to finance this year's budget. We're in a position where our financing has been termed out and so forth. But we have gathered together in solidarity, and we have had meetings. That Caribbean Economic Recovery Task Force has had meetings with the Washington-based institutions advocating for our brothers and sisters in the region. And so there is that kind of solidarity, because it's going to be important that we stick together. There's no doubt that the world is going to face a debt crisis. Several countries in the world are going to face a debt crisis, and the key behind all that we're proposing to do here today is just to ensure that Jamaica is not among those. Right? It's inevitable based on where countries find themselves today. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Dr. Tufton.
Madam Speaker, before I begin, in the interest of public health and wellness, Madam Speaker is a bit distracted, so let me just refer to my colleagues. Through you, Madam Speaker, when you're speaking with the use of the shield, and I saw where my colleagues on the opposite side, you don't speak, you stand directly in front of the shield. That's the purpose of the shield, to protect. that was an early observation, so I just want to make the point that you stand behind the it's not there to avoid, it's there to protect. Madam Speaker, I rise to speak to this Honourable House and the people of Jamaica on the day that this globally recognized, a day that is globally recognized as World AIDS Day. Today we remember and salute persons who would have died, and to the many others who are living, Madam Speaker, with HIV. Madam Speaker, the COVID-19 global pandemic has presented a myriad of challenges to the HIV/AIDS response on an international scale. It is heartening to see us coming together under the theme of World AIDS Day 2020, a theme titled Global Solidarity Through Our Shared Responsibility. Madam Speaker, the Government of Jamaica's response to HIV has continued to cater to the needs of the vulnerable and key populations and persons living with HIV. The support of the global community and the commitment of our local stakeholders has enabled our national program to continue to offer services at all levels. Madam Speaker, we are extremely grateful for the support of our partners here in Jamaica and around the world. The number of persons becoming newly HIV infected each year is still too high. There were some 700 new cases diagnosed in Jamaica in 2019. As many as 4,500, or 14% of persons living with HIV in Jamaica, are unaware of their status. Madam Speaker, only 14,297, or 44% of those diagnosed, are on antiretroviral treatment, and only 66% of those on treatment are virally suppressed. During this pandemic, the National HIV Program has continued to offer services, Madam Speaker, including the development of a response team with partners and our civil society organizations to ensure the following. Supply chain is maintained, this is of drugs and services. Prevention activities are implemented in a safe and respectful way to all populations. Service delivery was maintained within the country for persons living with HIV. The continued provision of social services, the development of protocols to engage clients within the setting, mechanisms to continue health systems strengthening, and finally mechanisms to ensure that the human rights are protected and maintained. Madam Speaker, from 2018, the Ministry's mandate has been the dispensing of multi-months of antiretrovirals. With the onset of COVID-19, there was some disruption of the global supply chain, from sourcing of base products to manufacturing and logistics in air freight. This was compounded with the lockdown of India, the major manufacturer of antiretroviral worldwide. Despite that threat, Madam Speaker, Jamaica, through monitoring and proactive intervention, has been able to maintain an uninterrupted supply of AVRs to persons living with HIV for the past 3 years. Madam Speaker, through collaboration with the private pharmacies across the island, increased locations to access ARVs have also been provided. Our work is not done, Madam Speaker, and we acknowledge the concerns expressed by persons living with HIV, and we are reinforcing our commitment to providing access to medication and monitoring supplies. This will ensure the standard of service delivery is maintained and each person living with HIV is able to achieve viral suppression and live their best life. I want to use the opportunity, Madam Speaker, today on World AIDS Day to challenge us to work together and continue to do all that is required to safeguard the health and wellness of our mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, and children living with or affected by HIV and AIDS, whilst also, Madam Speaker, paying respect to those who lost their lives to the disease. Together, Madam Speaker, we can achieve global solidarity through shared responsibility. Madam Speaker, I wish to also speak on the matter of our continued management of this global pandemic, which as of yesterday, November 30, saw some 62,195,274 cases globally, according to the World Health Organization. The number of confirmed deaths, and I'm speaking about COVID-19 now, Madam Speaker, across the world continues to increase at the same period, reaching up to yesterday 1,453,355. Locally, Madam Speaker, our total confirmed cases has surpassed the 10,000 mark, and as at November 30th, stood at some 10,810 confirmed cases with 258 deaths. The country is currently managing some 4,040 active cases across the island. COVID-19 is still clear and presently a dangerous pandemic virus to our population, and it cannot be said enough that as a country, Madam Speaker, we must continue to be vigilant as we continue life in the new normal, living with COVID. I again invite all our stakeholders, Madam Speaker, including members of the public, to adhere to the guidelines provided by Cabinet and this Honourable House with the technical support of the Ministry of Health and Wellness. In keeping with the need to have COVID-19 at the forefront of our activities, as policymakers, I have discussed, Madam Speaker, with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and we have signed off, and in keeping with the desires too of the opposition, on the reappointment or the appointment or the establishment of the Special Select Committee on COVID-19. Madam Speaker, you would recall that we had that Special Select Committee during the last Parliament, and we are going to announce or re-establish that committee. The names will be announced at our next sitting, Madam Speaker. In conjunction, of course, with the leader of government business, we will recommend members of this Honourable House to establish the Special Select Committee. This committee will have specific responsibility for the oversight of Jamaica's COVID-19 response, and a second committee dedicated to looking at the introduction of the COVID vaccine. Madam Speaker, members of this House, we are making progress, I think, as a world, and that's the silver lining, if you will, the glimmer of hope around finding a vaccine for COVID-19. In fact, there is word that as early as this month, there are some jurisdictions that are likely to have emergency approval for trial of certain vaccines, and that augurs well for the response to COVID to finally overcome the main threat that it represents without a vaccine. But we do believe, and this is based on our expert advice coming out of PAHO WHO, that by the end of the first quarter of next year, March, we should see approved vaccines being distributed, and certainly going into the summer months of next year, there should be mass distribution. Now, a lot remains to get to that point, but this is certainly encouraging news. We want to be in a position, Madam Speaker, colleagues, to be able to manage the distribution of that process in a way that is transparent and in a way that ensures that those who need it most will get access. And so this committee will be drawn from stakeholder groups to ensure that that actually takes place. Madam Speaker, in keeping with the need to have COVID-19 at the forefront, I've said that we will establish this committee around vaccines. I want to take the opportunity to thank members of the previous Special Select Committee who made significant contribution. Sorry, name them. There are many on both sides, Madam Speaker, but the Special Select Committee was a committee that really did some work, and I think on both sides. And I think the House and the country should recognize them for their efforts. Unfortunately, some of them are not here now, based on a particular event, particularly on that side. But I know we will pass on the word to them for the contribution that they have made. In the same vein, members of the new Special Select Committee will deliberate on matters related to the overall management of COVID. So the mandate will be pretty similar. Additionally, with news that a new COVID-19 vaccine is going to come shortly, then the committee which will be appointed will be responsible to work with public health to develop a COVID-19 vaccine plan. And it is very urgent that we move quickly to get this up and running. Vaccination has proven, Madam Speaker, an undeniable success in the public health toolkit to reduce the burden of infectious disease. And already, the Ministry of Health and Wellness has in draft a plan to manage the introduction of the vaccine to the country. So we are already putting a plan in place and will therefore work with that committee to outline, to fine-tune that plan, and to accompany that plan with a public education program. The committee will see the involvement also of clinical experts within the Ministry of Health and Wellness, as well as private sector players. It will also have the participation of logistics planning experts, social behavioral experts to manage the behavioral change intervention that must accompany the implementation. Madam Speaker, vaccination, while critical to human development in our country, based on our history, has also attracted a lot of criticisms, and I think it's going to be important for us to have a national conversation around the need for the vaccine and also to overcome some of the stigma and the pushback that I know some may be identified with in the public space against the public health and wellness or the public health interest. So we intend to do that, Madam Speaker. Let me remind the Honourable House, Madam Speaker, that Jamaica is among the CARICOM member states on whose behalf a down payment has been made by the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARFA, for equitable access to a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine through the COVID-19 Global Access Facility, or COVAX facility. In closing, Madam Speaker, I wish also to remind members of the public, especially members of our vulnerable population, and in keeping with the season, that this time of year we should be particularly careful, Madam Speaker. In fact, this time of year up to January is a time when we see increases in respiratory and influenza-like illnesses, and therefore we must make every effort, Madam Speaker, to take the necessary precautions to be safe, because the virus, the COVID virus, as well as the typical public health threats that we face this time of year, can amplify the situation and can lead to serious illness and even death. I want to again use the platform of the Parliament, and I think all of us should, whenever we get a chance here and other places, to just encourage Jamaicans about the critical protocols of wearing masks, washing hands, keeping physical distancing, sticking to the quarantine or isolation requirements. In fact, the Ministry has just launched a campaign which we will take to all the town centres or main town centres throughout the country around masking up before you talk up, because we do recognise that while the physical distance is an ideal scenario. When you get into the town centers, particularly during this busy season, it is challenging to actually obtain that. But if you wear your mask, which you should have full control over, and insist that others around you do the same, or others communicating with you, it will certainly reduce the risk of transmitting the virus. Madam Speaker, thank you very much. So please you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. See, I had a little difficulty catching my eye. I want to thank you, Minister, for this presentation and bringing to the fore in the Parliament and to the entire country the commemoration of World Health AIDS Day 2020. We have come a far way as a world in terms of HIV/AIDS from 1981, when it was first, I wouldn't say discovered, but first clinically categorized as HIV/AIDS. We have seen over 75 million persons have been infected with HIV since then, and about 33 million have died worldwide. Minister in his presentation indicated that for COVID we have 62 million so far worldwide and 1.5 million deaths. But there are different conditions in terms of how aggressive they are, and hence we have this disparity. But we indeed have come a far way. We are now have antiretrovirals, Madam Speaker. But despite what we have done so good as a country, there have been certain drawbacks. I want to congratulate all those health workers who have been in the field in the management of HIV/AIDS in Jamaica. But at the same time, Madam Speaker, if one were to look at a recent study done by, I think it's Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, that the biggest transgressors in terms of victimization against HIV/AIDS persons are one, private individuals at 36% and healthcare workers at 35%, based on the study that was done over the period of 2006 to 2020. So even though we have progressed on the scale of treating the illness, we still have some challenges in the health sector, and it is something that, Minister, we should aspire to have our health workers trained. Yes, they have been trained, but a little more humanizing, for want of a better word, in the treatment of how these persons living with HIV/AIDS are treated. The fact is, a lot of it has to do with fear. Just like in COVID, fear. And sometimes health professionals tend to shy away from fear. But just as how we try to protect ourselves from any other type of illnesses, certainly it is a way that we can protect ourselves from getting HIV/AIDS, which is transmitted even totally differently from COVID or any other viral illnesses. The other point of note, Madam Speaker, is that in terms of our viral suppression rates in Jamaica, the recent UNAIDS report, which was published on the 3rd of November 2020, indicated that, and Minister supported it with his presentations, though not indicating that other aspect, that in terms of viral suppression, we are lower than where we should be. And part of it, Minister, and in my sectoral presentation, I made reference to it, that with the coming of COVID-19 and the need for the COBAS machine at the National Public Health Laboratory to be tasked for PCR testing for COVID, there has been a reduction in the number of cases, and as UNAIDS reported, a backlog in the number of viral suppression tests that have been done, so we do not know the full numbers right now. Now that you have additional machinery at the National Public Health Laboratory, and the capacity is in excess of what is actually being done now, plus the advent of antigen testing, it probably is a proper time, Minister, for that particular aspect of viral loads to be tested so that we can have a fair idea, so that we can reduce also the transmission of HIV/AIDS. Because studies have demonstrated that where you have low viral loads, then there's less likelihood of transmission of HIV during sex, unprotected sex even. Now, the other matter, Minister, is the mother-to-child transmission program and the certification that Jamaica was on track to getting up to 2015. In December 2016, there were 6 Caribbean countries that got that certification from PAHO, WHO. Jamaica was on track, but unfortunately did not meet that, and we were never one of those 6, the 6 being Antigua, Anguilla, Bermuda, Cayman Island, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Cuba had it earlier on. But we were on track, Minister, but we fell below the level. I would like to know where we are with that and what measures are being put in to ensure that we get the certification from PAHO, WHO, so that Jamaica can be one of those countries where we can say that we have eliminated mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS. The matter, Madam Speaker, is that HIV/AIDS can be contained, can be controlled, if our people practice the appropriate measure, practice best sexual practices, have protection during sexual intercourse. And unfortunately, a lot of our Jamaicans have taken this particular message very lightly in terms of how the practice, sexual practices are. And despite the many interventions in terms of workshops, in terms of public advisories, in terms of ads, what we have seen is that we are continuing to have, as the Minister said, 700 last year. The numbers were less sometime before, but it is because of the nature of our people in not adhering to the recommendations that we see the numbers being where they are. Madam Speaker, I'm very happy that the Minister has indicated that we are re-establishing the Select Committee on COVID-19. I think this committee served a very useful purpose, as you did indicate, Minister, and there was a very fruitful exchange of ideas, thoughts, recommendations whilst we had the deliberations. I'm, however, going to suggest, Minister, that in your consultation with the leader of government business, that the ratio in which the committees are selected for other areas do not obtain here. Because what we need basically are people who want to contribute to it. It's not an adversarial committee that we're looking. So where you can get the best ideas from, I think that is where we should be looking, and not necessarily in the ratio that has been the case with the other committees. No, not necessarily equal. But I'm just saying, okay, like say, for example, it's a 5-to-1 that has been happening in some other committees, 6-to-1. We need a cross-fertilization of ideas. So it's a recommendation I'm making. All right. So, Madam Speaker, this committee, you also mentioned that there's another committee that is to be formulated, Minister, is it another parliamentary committee, or is it a committee? Because there was a suggestion, it was not actually clear in your statement that this did not involve parliamentarians. And whilst you're on that, Minister, I know that you said that this particular committee will look at the overall implementation of the vaccine program. The vaccine that has been the forerunner so far in terms of studies, and so is the Pfizer one, which the experts tell us, the manufacturers tell us that we need to store it at minus 70 degrees centigrade. The challenge we have now is if it makes the #1 position in terms of what is available first and will be accredited and will give them approval status by WHO, what provisions have and are we making in Jamaica in the likelihood that that is a particular vaccine that we're going to be utilizing? Because when you think of minus 70 degrees centigrade, it is not many facilities that have that, and most of our vaccine refrigerators now looking at about minus 4 to minus 10 as the lowest that they can go. So I want to know if provisions are being made, contingencies are being made to ensure that if that is the one that makes the best headway and gets the approval first, and we will be beneficiaries under that WHO program that we have paid for as a country, then if that is the vaccine, what provisions will be made in this country for that? Minister, I cannot end without endorsing the point you made about beseeching our Jamaicans to practice the protocols that are around. The wearing of masks, and I'm not wearing mine right now, but the wearing of masks, the physical distancing, we have some of it here, the not congregating in those large numbers, and doing all the necessary steps to prevent COVID-19. COVID-19, as you said, still a gone. And the truth is that many people do not appreciate and accept that it has serious consequences for those not only who have comorbid conditions, but for some people, based on how their particular genetic setup is, that they are more prone to get serious illnesses, and unfortunately some of them die. So we have to ensure, we have to continually be at our neighbors, at our community persons, in the public space to say to them, please adhere to the protocols, to the measures that are out there to ensure that you do not get it and you do not pass it on to the next one. And finally, Minister, to say thanks again to those other workers who are involved in the COVID fight on behalf of the Jamaican people.
Thank you, colleague. Madam Speaker, through you. My colleague has said a lot, and I agree with most of what he has said, certainly as it relates to the HIV response. The issues around discrimination are real, and in fact, it has been the case for some time. I think it's getting better. But the truth is, a number of the other issues that you have identified are linked to discrimination, or stigma, I should say, stigma in the first instance, as it relates specifically to the healthcare system. And you're singling out stigma and discrimination among healthcare workers. It is a challenge that we have identified, and we have been moving for greater sensitization and training in order to overcome that challenge. I think it's something that we still have to watch, still have to monitor. I'm not going to say that it has totally dissipated, but I think it is getting better and has gotten better. The issues around viral suppression and the need for testing COVID has thrown a lot of things off the radar, and we have to now refocus to try and get back on track. It is true that there is more to be done because it is out of the information that we can take action. We are committed, and we're working with our critical stakeholder partners, to try and achieve greater sensitization and greater willingness to engage in the testing process. But again, I don't think anyone would doubt the distraction, if you will, that COVID has caused over the last 8 or 9 months. We know the general messaging around unprotected sex. But what is interesting, and it's a debate we will have another time, is that the categories of high-risk groups along that HIV risk profile is adjusting somewhat. And, there was a time when persons would say this is a gay disease, for want of a better term. The truth is that is no longer the case. And part of the sensitization that needs to take place is that we are all vulnerable. In fact, one of the fastest growing categories is actually not linked to, it's linked to a lifestyle that is multifaceted. In other words, both same-sex lifestyle, but also heterosexual activity. So there's going to have to be a frank discussion. That's the point I'm trying to make. And that frank discussion is going to be what is needed to overcome the stigma. And if we overcome the stigma, then we can deal with the discrimination. And it's something that the government, certainly I as minister, I'm committed to championing that cause, working with my Minister of State, who sits a few rows down from me, who is taking on that challenge and will play a very key role, I believe, in the months to come, and has been doing a good job, a very good job so far. In terms of the COVID response and the ratios of the Special Select Committee, I have no difficulty with that. You may have a greater challenge than I on this side, because clearly you're making a bid for greater numbers on your side, but your numbers are somewhat restricted in this new dispensation. But to the extent that you have members available, we will have a conversation. But I have no issues at all with widening the vaccine committee is really a committee not of Parliament. It's a multi-stakeholder committee, and we are putting in place a plan to begin to at least present something to that committee. But that committee is going to do more than just develop a plan. That committee has to be a critical voice to articulate, why the plan is important, to help to push and gain public's confidence in the process, and also in the vaccine and take-up of the vaccine, which I foresee may be an issue because, again, of the perceptions around the vaccine so early after COVID has been discovered, and the distractions around whether or not it's healthy, whether it will create more harm than good. It's something that we're going to have to grapple with as a country and as public policy. The storage issue is a challenge, but is incorporated in the overall plan. We're being guided by WHO. There are, I'm told, 11 trials that are taking place, approximately 11 clinical trials, meaning 11 different vaccines. So this particular one is definitely one of those that we have high hopes for, but there are others. To the extent that this one is the front runner, then we will have to have the systems in place to deal with it, and that's part of the overall plan. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Annual report of the Office of the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons from April 2018 to March 2020. Report of the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives on its deliberations on the motion for exemption brought on behalf of members of Parliament for St. Elizabeth, Northeastern, St. James, Southern, and St. Mary Southeastern, and the Auditor General's audit of the COVID-19 allocation of resources for employees care program.
Bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate. To the Honorable House of Representatives, I have the honor to advise the Honorable House of Representatives that on the 27th day of November 2020, a bill entitled An Act to Temporarily Modify the Representation of the People Act in order to postpone the holding of a general election of members to serve on the respective councils of municipal corporations and a general election of the mayors of city municipalities was passed in the Senate without amendment. Signed, Thomas Tavares Finson, OJCD, QC, JP, President of the Senate.
Petitions, reports from committees.
Madam Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives on its deliberation on the motions for exemptions brought on behalf of the Members of Parliament for St. Elizabeth Northeastern, St. James Southern, and St. Mary Southeastern.
Notices of motions given orally.
Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Tobacco Control Act 2020.
Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice at the next meeting of the House, I'll move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Independent Fiscal Commission Act 2020. And Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the National Housing Trust Amendment Act 2020. And Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Financial Administration and Audit Amendment Act 2020. Madam Speaker, at a later stage today, I beg to move that these three bills,
Questions?
No. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motions. Whereas subsection 1G of section 41 of the Constitution of Jamaica requires a member of this Honourable House of Representatives to vacate his seat if any firm in which he is a partner or any company of which he is a director or a manager becomes a party to any contract with the Government of Jamaica for on account of the public service, or if he becomes a partner in a firm or a director or a manager of a company which is a party to any such contract. And whereas a member of Parliament for Manchester Southern is a managing director of Asura Security Company Limited, which provides private security services a director of WFIO Business Consulting Limited, which provides consultancy in procurement, strategic planning, risk management, project management, and business services. A director of Lai Shenkar Distributors Limited, a wholesaler and retailer of food items, and general manager of Active Gear Limited, which supplies uniforms and uniform accessories to military and paramilitary organizations and provide electronic gadgets and identification services. And whereas these entities may from time to time enter into contract with the government of Jamaica and its affiliated agencies, and whereas the member has disclosed his interest in these entities, be it resolved that this motion be referred to the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report. Madam Speaker, second motion, whereas subject to Section 1G of Section 41 of the Constitution of Jamaica requires a member of this Honourable House of Representatives to vacate his seat if any firm in which he is a partner or any company of which he is a director or manager becomes a party to any contract with the government of Jamaica for on account of the public service, or if he becomes a partner in a firm or a director or manager of a company which is a party to any such contract. And whereas the Member of Parliament for Westmoreland Eastern is a director and shareholder of Danstar Transport Company Limited, a provider of transport services. And whereas this entity may from time to time enter into contracts with the government of Jamaica and its affiliated agencies, and whereas the member has disclosed his interest in this entity, be it resolved that this motion be referred to the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report. And, Madam Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take these two motions.
Questions and answers to questions.
Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that after 21 days, I wish to ask the Most Honourable Prime Minister these questions in relation to mining at Puerto Bueno, Dry Harbour Mountain.
Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business.
Madam Speaker, I would ask that the Minister of Finance, who has a bill entitled the Civil Service and Establishment General Amendment Order 2020, now move the appropriate resolution.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to open debate on the Civil Service Establishment Act General Amendment Order 2020. Madam Speaker, in accordance with the Civil Service Establishment Act 1976 and the Civil Service Establishment Act General Amendment Order 2020 has been prepared and is presented to indicate the changes to the Civil Service Establishment Act General Order 2019. Madam Speaker, this is a routine exercise that's conducted annually. The civil service, at any point in time, the composition of it is determined by an Establishment Act order, and hiring outside of what is provided for in this order is against the law. As the needs of the country change, therefore, on an annual basis, we update the civil service establishment. One year we might need more of this in one place or across the ministries, departments, and agencies of government. So, Madam Speaker, the Civil Service Establishment Act General Amendment Order 2020 outlines the reorganization of ministries and departments and consequently the creation of new posts, abolition of posts, and the reclassification, upgrading, and retitling of existing posts. I'll just give a summary, Madam Speaker, of the changes via the Establishment Amendment Order 2019. Madam Speaker, the major changes to be effected in the Civil Service Establishment Act General Amendment Order 2020 are in support of strengthening of the capacity of the Jamaican court system and enhancing social security program delivery. These changes include 87 and 33 new posts were established across the family and parish courts respectively. This will aid in the reduction of the number of case adjournment and backlog cases, as well as improve the turnaround time concerning the mention of current cases in the courts with greater assurance that cases are ready to proceed at the earliest court hearing date with certainty. The Court Management Services Department has also been incorporated into the Supreme Court as a new Court Administration Division. This restructuring of the staffing and structural arrangements should further strengthen judicial independence, enabling the courts to have greater input in budgetary decisions and allowing for increased cohesion between this division and the Supreme Court. Madam Speaker, with respect to Social Security program delivery, 50 new posts were established for the Early Stimulation Program in the Ministry of Labour and Social Security to enhance accountability, efficient and effective reporting, and overall delivery of the program island-wide. The majority of the newly created posts are primarily in Kingston, St. James, and Portland. Madam Speaker, Civil Service Establishment Act General Order 2020 reflects changes in 3 other areas. Part 1, Madam Speaker, shows changes in the complement of posts in the ministries and departments. These changes include retitling, reclassification, and upgrading of posts, as well as the creation of new posts and the effective dates for these changes. These changes are broken down as follows. 251 new posts were created, 72 posts were upgraded, 29 posts were reclassified, 179 posts were retitled, and 1 post was red circled. In Part 2, Madam Speaker, shows the revised salary scales for the dental surgeon series under the health professional category. This is in line with the heads of agreement signed between the Government of Jamaica and that bargaining group for the 2017 to 20 period. Madam Speaker, the final section shows the abolition of 13 posts from the establishment of 6 ministries and departments. Madam Speaker, just to note, the Post Operations Committee of the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, which comprises members from the Ministry, officers of the Services Commission, and the Jamaica Civil Service Association, continues to meet regularly to review the civil service establishment, including considering requests and comments from various ministries, departments, and agencies. This is done with the objective of improving the efficiency of the establishment, as well as the delivery of service to the nation. Madam Speaker, I ask that this Honourable House approves the Civil Service Establishment General Amendment Order 2020.
The question before the House is that the Civil Service Establishment General Amendment Order 2020 resolution be approved. Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, request a second reading. No.
That's it. That brings it to an end, Minister.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
The question before the House is that the standing orders be suspended to enable the Deputy to take the motions notice of which she gave earlier. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, I now move that the motion, notice of which I gave earlier, be approved.
Question before the House is that the motion, notice of which was given earlier, be approved. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Motion's approved.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to allow me to take the motions in relation to the exemption of the member of Manchester Southern and the member from Westmoreland Eastern, notice of which I gave earlier.
Question before the House is that we move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable the minister to take the motions in relation to the exemption of two members, notice of which he gave earlier. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, I now move that the motions, notice of which I gave earlier, be approved.
The question before the House is that the motions, notice of which was given earlier, be now approved. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business for the day. I beg to move that the House be adjourned. That the House be adjourned until Tuesday, the 8th of December at 2 p.m. at George William Gordon House. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
The question before the House is that the House be now adjourned until next week, Tuesday, the 8th of December. Those in favor? And those against? Now, members, there are three things. One, I want to convey to all the members who participated from Customs, Commissioner of Customs was grateful for the participation and looks forward to other sessions. I want to remind members of the seminar we have tomorrow, and then next week, the 8th, there will be a special Christmas luncheon staged for members downstairs since we are now at home.
When?
Next week, Tuesday.
Okay.
So the House is now adjourned until next week, Tuesday, the 2nd of December. Next week, Tuesday, the 8th of December. Minister Morgan, please don't leave before I see you. Please.
This was good.
We remain resilient in our fight against